This company never set out to arm anyone. It was built to sell windmills. Steel windmills nobody wanted. The business was nearly dead by 1888. Then a watchmaker dropped a metal toy gun on the manager's desk. He said, "Boy, that is a daisy." Within 7 years, the windmills were gone, and the factory's new product would end up in millions of American childhoods and quietly inside U.S. Army training rooms. You already know what the gun looks like, even if you have never held one. A lever-action carbine, scaled down for small hands, the kind a 9-year-old begs for at Christmas while every adult in the room warns that he will shoot his eye out. Red Ryder. It has been on screen, in catalogs, in basements and backyards for the better part of a century. Today it still rolls out of a plant in Rogers, Arkansas, where a company called Daisy makes more than 250,000 air guns a year, owned now by a private equity firm in New York and folded in beside a Spanish manufacturer. That last part already sounds slightly wrong. The most American object in the toy box, sitting on a balance sheet next to a company from Barcelona. But that is the small irony. Here's the big one. This company, the one whose name became shorthand for an entire category of childhood, was never supposed to make guns at all. It was supposed to pump water. And the only reason it survived long enough to become a legend is that it was willing, again and again, to murder its own past. To understand that, you have to go back to a drugstore window in Plymouth, Michigan, in the early 1880s.
In that window sat a man named Clarence Hamilton, repairing watches. He was a tinkerer, the kind of restless mechanical mind that can't leave a problem alone, and the problem he became obsessed with wasn't timekeeping. It was wind. Across rural America in those years, more than 6 million windmills had gone up, most of them wood, all of them doing the unglamorous work of pulling water out of the ground for farms and livestock and the steam trains that crossed the country. Hamilton looked at all that wood and bet on steel. He designed a vaneless steel windmill, secured a patent, and in January of 1882 a group of local backers, including a druggist named Root and a man named Louis Cass Hauff, incorporated the Plymouth Iron Windmill Company. They were serious about it. They bought 25 acres in the middle of town for $400 and put up a 2-story brick building with 8,000 square feet of floor space. This was not a hobby. This was a town betting on a man's idea that metal would beat timber. The problem was that metal was heavy. A steel windmill is a magnificent thing to own and a miserable thing to sell. It cost more than the wooden ones farmers already trusted. And to get it to the farmer, you had to load that weight onto a wagon and haul it across the back roads of Michigan, down into northern Indiana, over into Ohio, slow, expensive, brutal on the horses and the schedule. The thing the company had bet everything on was the exact thing strangling it. By the middle of the 1880s, sales were sagging. By 1888, the Plymouth Iron Windmill Company was close to liquidation. The brick building, the 25 acres, the patent, the whole confident wager on steel, all of it was about to come to nothing. So the board did what desperate companies do. It went looking for anything else it could build and sell. Something cheaper, something lighter, something that fit on a shelf instead of a freight wagon. And it happened that the answer was already being manufactured across the street. There was another small operation in Plymouth called the Markham Air Rifle Company. Markham had started in 1886, and it made a wooden air rifle called the Chicago, a cheap little spring gun that fired lead shot, the sort of thing sold to boys and farmers for plinking. It sold. People bought it. And the windmill company, hunting for a lifeline, could see it selling. This is where the watchmaker comes back into the story. Clarence Hamilton, the same man who had designed the steel windmill that was now killing the company, brought a different invention to the windmill company's management. It was an AIR rifle. But where Markham's was mostly wood, Hamilton's was made almost entirely of metal. He cocked it, dropped a lead shot down the barrel, and fired it into a wastebasket in front of Louis Cass Hauff, the general manager. And Hauff, the story goes, looked at it and said, "Boy, that's a daisy."
That line is woven into every telling of this company's history, and it deserves one honest caveat. It's the kind of origin quote that gets polished a little brighter every decade, treated as the company's cherished legend rather than a transcript. But the name stuck. Whatever was actually said in that room, the little metal gun walked out of it carrying a flower's name and the beginnings of a future the windmill company couldn't yet imagine. There's a second legend attached to those first guns, and it's worth handling with the same care. The popular story is that the windmill company gave the air rifle away free, a premium, a bonus, handed to every farmer who bought a steel windmill. It's a charming image. The gun is a sweetener for the product that was failing. But at least one serious collector of this history has pointed out there's no real proof the giveaway ever happened, and that the simpler explanation is the likelier one. The company wasn't running a clever marketing scheme. It was a drowning business grabbing at a second product that might float. Premium or not, the result was the same, and the result was the part nobody saw coming. The toy outsold the windmill. Not by a little. The first guns were made in late 1887 and started selling in early 1888, and almost immediately, the math went strange. People didn't particularly want a heavy steel windmill hauled across 3 states. They did want a cheap metal gun they could buy off a shelf. Orders for the air rifle climbed, while orders for the windmill kept sliding, and the company found itself in a quietly absurd position. The thing it was named for, the thing it had bet a town's money on, was now the dead weight, and the afterthought was the business. By 1889, air rifle production had completely replaced the windmills. The machines that had been built to make steel towers were now turning out little guns. And in 1895, the company stopped pretending. It reorganized, dropped the windmills entirely, and gave itself a new name, the Daisy Manufacturing Company. Named, in other words, after the throwaway. The steel windmill, the founding idea, the whole reason any of these men had pooled their money in the first place, was simply gone, erased from the front of the building as if it had never mattered. And the man who started all of it, Clarence Hamilton, sold his interest in the company in 1898 and walked away to make iron-framed rifles of his own design. The inventor of the windmill and the inventor of the gun that buried the windmill, the same restless watchmaker, left before the company that owed him everything became famous. That's the first thing to understand about Daisy. It didn't survive despite abandoning its own past. It survived by abandoning it. The founding product, then the founder himself, shed in under a decade. It would not be the last time. Because here's the detail that complicates the heroic version of all this. Daisy didn't even invent the thing it became famous for. Remember Markham? Across the street. The company was already selling the wooden Chicago when Hamilton walked in with his metal version. Markham got there first. Markham had the first commercially successful BB gun in America. By any fair telling, Markham was the pioneer and Daisy was the imitator who happened to use more metal. So how did history forget Markham and remember Daisy? It forgot because Daisy ate it. In 1912, executives connected to Daisy bought the Markham Company outright. For years, it kept running under its own identity. Then in 1928, it was renamed the King Manufacturing Company, and in 1931, Daisy absorbed it completely.
The Pioneer became a subsidiary, then a brand name, then a footnote. The outsider that arrived second, the windmill company with no business making guns, ended up owning the very company that had shown it how. The army of collectors who track this history know Markham's name. Almost nobody else does. That's not an accident of memory. That's the result of a purchase. So now Daisy had the gun, and it had eliminated the rival who got there first. But a gun is only half of a product. The other half is ammunition. And the story of how Daisy came to control that too starts not in a boardroom but in a scrap yard in Minneapolis. The name BB itself is a leftover. It comes from an old shotgun shot size, a particular diameter of round lead pellet roughly a fraction under 2/10 of an inch, and the early air guns simply used what was already lying around. But lead shot is soft, and at some point in the 1920s, Daisy started noticing something odd. Guns were coming back to the factory jammed, ruined, with steel balls lodged where lead pellets were supposed to be. And the jammed guns all seemed to be coming from the same place, the Minneapolis area. The explanation? When the company chased it down, was almost comic. Boys around Minneapolis had discovered that the local scrapyard of a firm called the American Ball Company was full of reject steel ball bearings, free ammunition if you weren't picky. So they fed those steel bearings into their air guns. The trouble was that the rejects were reject for a reason. Some were slightly oversized, just enough to lodge in a barrel and wreck the gun. Daisy was getting blamed for a defect that was really a story about kids and free metal. A smaller company might have just printed a warning. Daisy bought the scrapyard's parent business. It acquired American Ball, moved the operation to Plymouth, and turned a nuisance into a pipeline. If oversized steel bearings were jamming guns, then Daisy would simply make the steel BB itself to its own size and sell the ammunition along with the gun. The complaint became a product line, and it became an enormous one. By the late 1980s, the company was turning out more than 55 million BBs a day. Read that number again. A windmill company that nearly liquidated in 1888 was, a century later, manufacturing 55 million steel balls every single day to feed the guns it had stumbled into making. That's the pattern, and by now you can see it repeating. Daisy didn't plan its way to dominance. It improvised. It grabbed the gun when the windmill failed. It bought the rival who invented the gun. It bought the ammunition source when free scrap embarrassed it. Each move solved an immediate problem, and each move quietly made the company bigger and harder to kill. It was an organism that survived by absorbing whatever threatened it. But owning the gun and owning the ammunition still wasn't enough. There was one thing Daisy didn't yet have, the thing that would turn a cheap metal toy into a permanent fixture of American childhood. It didn't have a reason for a child to lie awake wanting one. It had a product. What it needed was a myth. And in the 1930s, that's exactly what Daisy went out and bought. The country was in the Depression. Money was scarce, factories were closing, and a company selling a discretionary metal toy to families who could barely afford shoes should have been finished. Instead, Daisy did something counterintuitive. It prospered. And it prospered because it understood, earlier than most, that it was no longer really selling a piece of stamped metal. It was selling a story a kid could climb inside. So Daisy went looking for heroes. It tied its guns to the cowboys and adventurers who were filling movie screens, radio serials, and the Sunday comics. There were models named for Western and serial characters, Buzz Barton and Buck Jones. Then, in 1934, in the depths of the Depression, came the Buck Rogers rocket pistol and its companion, the disintegrator, ray gun fantasies for children who wanted to be spacemen. People bought them. A company that had no business thriving in 1934 was thriving, because it had figured out that the want mattered more than the object. Daisy wasn't competing on price or power. It was competing on imagination. And imagination didn't cost the customer anything until the moment they reached for their wallet. Then, in 1940, came the one that made it permanent. 2 years earlier, a cartoonist named Fred Harmon had introduced a comic strip cowboy called Red Ryder, syndicated to newspapers across the country. He was everywhere. Papers, books, films. And in March of 1940, Daisy put his name on a lever-action BB gun, the Red Ryder. It was the same trick the company had been running for a decade, the marriage of cheap metal and borrowed legend. But this time, the legend was the right one at the right moment, and it fused to the product so completely that it never came off. The Red Ryder stopped being a model. It became the thing every American boy of a certain era was supposed to want.
Daisy had spent 50 years figuring out how to manufacture desire, and with Red Ryder, it finally did it permanently. And then the steel disappeared. When the United States entered the Second World War, the government decided what the country's metal was for, and a children's air gun was not on the list. The War Production Board barred non-essential manufacturers from using steel and other strategic materials, and just like that, the company couldn't make the product that defined it. The Red Ryder, 2 years into its life, went dark. For the second time in its history, the thing Daisy was named for was taken away. Except this time it wasn't a failing windmill the company chose to abandon. It was a thriving gun the government simply switched off. So Daisy did the only thing it had ever known how to do. It adapted into something else entirely. If it couldn't make toys, it would make war. The Plymouth factory turned to military contracts and subcontracts, the unglamorous guts of a war economy. It produced 37mm canisters. It made gaskets for AC spark plug, switches for square D, ball races, washers, and metal dies for Bendix Aviation and others, components that vanished into engines and aircraft and equipment whose names the public would never connect to a BB gun. By the company's own accounting, somewhere around a quarter of its sales between 1942 and 1945 came from war work. The rest came from toys it could still legally make out of wood, like the Commando and the Chattermatic, guns with no steel and no power, sold to kids while the real steel went to the front. The war reached the company's leadership too. Cass Howe, son of the Howe family that had run Daisy for decades, and a future president of the company, went on active duty in the 8th Air Force roughly 6 months before Pearl Harbor. He became a colonel and a notable test pilot. The man who would one day run the BB gun company spent the war flying for the Air Force that was dropping the real ordnance over Europe. That's the quiet truth underneath the toy. The line between the plaything and the weapon, between the factory floor and the war machine, was always thinner than the marketing suggested. When the war ended and the steel came back, Daisy restarted. Full BB gun production resumed in 1947, led by the Red Ryder, which came back as if it had never left. Production got squeezed again during the Korean War, then recovered. A company that had survived a near bankruptcy, a depression, and a wartime shutdown was still standing, still stamping out guns and BBs, still selling the myth. And in peacetime, it picked up a new kind of customer, one that complicates the innocent story considerably: the United States Army. This is the part most people miss. The same lever-action toy that taught a child to plink cans in the backyard turned out to be a cheap, safe way to teach a soldier the reflex of shooting without thinking. The Army became interested in what was sometimes called instinctive shooting, or quick kill. The idea of training a person to hit a target by feel and snap reaction rather than careful aiming. Daisy airguns were used as training aids for exactly that, and kits were distributed during the Vietnam War. Real ammunition is expensive and dangerous to learn on. A BB gun is neither. The toy became a teaching tool, and the company that sold Christmas morning fantasies was quietly supplying the United States military with the means to build a recruit's first reflexes. It almost became much bigger. According to Cass Howe's own account of the company's history, the Army at one point asked Daisy for a quote on 50,000 replica BBE guns modeled on the M16, presumably to drill that same instinctive shooting on something shaped like the real service rifle. The quote was requested. The contract was never awarded. It's one of those small institutional footnotes that tells you how close the toy maker came to becoming an outright defense supplier on a large scale, and how a procurement decision can simply evaporate, leaving a company to wonder what might have been. The military thread didn't stop at the United States. Daisy's serious target guns, the Avanti line, were precise enough for real competition. Barrels came from the German maker Lothar Walter. and there was a competition gun venture with the German firm Feinwerkbau. Up in Canada, the cadet program adopted a Daisy Avanti target rifle for marksmanship training. So here's the company's split character, fully revealed. To a child, Daisy was a cowboy's name on a Christmas gift. To several militaries, it was a quiet, useful supplier of the tools you use to teach a person to shoot. Same factory, same name. Two completely different customers, and most of the people in one camp had no idea the other existed.
And then Daisy did the thing it always eventually does. It walked away from its own home. By the late 1950s, the company had been in Plymouth, Michigan for about 70 years. Plymouth was stamped on the guns. The town and the brand had grown up together. But Plymouth sat in the orbit of Detroit, and Detroit had become expensive. In 1958, Daisy packed up and moved south to Rogers, Arkansas, into a new plant of 350,000 square feet. The town whose name rode on every early gun lost the factory, and the abandonment was eventually total. The last surviving wall of the original Plymouth factory building stood for decades as a kind of monument until it was finally demolished in November of 2013. The windmill was gone, the founder was gone, the rival was gone, and now even the hometown was gone. Only the name survived, because the name was the one thing the company had learned never to throw away. For a while, the story could have ended there. A sweet, slightly ironic tale about a windmill company that became a national toy. But there's a darker thread running underneath the nostalgia, and it surfaced most visibly in the very phrase the toy is famous for. In 1983, a film called A Christmas Story made the Red Ryder eternal. A boy named Ralphie wants one gun and one gun only, and every adult in his life answers him with the same warning: you'll shoot your eye out. It's a joke, repeated until it's a national catchphrase. The detail collectors love is that the exact gun Ralphie describes, with a compass and a sundial in the stock, never really existed in that form. Those features belonged to a different Daisy model, and the studio had a handful of special props made for the film. The movie turned a small piece of corporate product into a permanent piece of American folklore, and it did it for free, every December, forever. But the warning in that joke was not entirely a joke. In October of 2002, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission filed a lawsuit against Daisy, seeking the recall of about 7.5 million of its Powerline air guns, two specific models, over an alleged defect. The concern was disturbingly specific. A BB could lodge inside the magazine where it could not be seen, so the gun could appear empty when it was not, and then fire. The commission staff said the guns had been linked to at least 15 deaths and 171 serious injuries, and that roughly 80% of those killed or hurt were children under 16. Daisy refused to issue a voluntary recall. The dispute was ultimately resolved through a settlement in 2003 that emphasized a safety education campaign rather than a formal recall. The outcome satisfied almost no one cleanly. Sit with the collision for a second. The same brand whose most famous cultural artifact is a mother saying, "You'll shoot your eye out," spent the early 2000s in a federal fight over guns that, the government alleged, had cost children their lives. The catchphrase and the casualty reports came from the same object. That's not a twist the marketing department ever wanted, and it's exactly the kind of discomfort that lives underneath a harmless product that has been in tens of millions of homes. The facts make the joke land differently. They're supposed to. Which brings us to the last abandonment and the strangest reframing of all. Who owns the most American toy in the world today? Not Americans exactly. In 2016, Daisy was sold to a New York private equity firm, Bruckman Rosser Sherrill and Company, and folded into a holding group alongside Gamo, a Spanish airgun manufacturer, and an archery products company.
The cowboy's name, the Christmas morning icon, the gun stamped with a Michigan town's identity, all of it became a line item in an investment portfolio, sharing a corporate parent with a firm from Spain. The plant in Rogers runs lean, with somewhere around 65 year-round employees still turning out 250,000 air guns a year. The brand is enormous in the culture and small as a business, which is precisely why it ended up where heritage brands tend to end up, owned by people who understand that the name is worth more than the factory. And so you arrive back where you started, except now you can see the machinery. A company built to sell steel windmills survived by killing the windmill, then erasing its founder, then swallowing the rival who invented its real product, then absorbing its ammunition supplier, then surviving a depression on borrowed myths, a world war on military contracts, and a safety scandal on a settlement, before finally selling itself to financiers who keep the name alive precisely because it cannot be reinvented. Daisy did not endure because it was loyal to anything. It endured because it was loyal to survival. The most familiar object in American childhood is, underneath the nostalgia, a study in how a company outlives every part of itself. If you want more hidden biographies like this one, the factories and contracts behind the names you thought you knew, then like this video, subscribe, and keep watching.